Ever notice how, like, one monument can just spark this huge debate? Like, the whole country gets caught up arguing about the past?
Yeah, it's like we're trying to figure out, I don't know, like what to do with these uncomfortable truths about
You know,
history.
it's like everywhere you turn, someone's grappling with uncomfortable historical truths, right? And that's exactly where we're headed in this deep dive. We're tackling this article.
Yeah.
It's called Never Admit Fault. And it really, it like throws everything we think we know out the window.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Like, what do you mean?
Okay, so the author, and this is important, they have a background in history, so it's not like,
Right, they're not just like coming up with this out of nowhere.
exactly. This is their field, and they come right out and say it. Countries, they should never apologize for anything they've done in the past.
Whoa.
Ever, ever. It's radical. It's like, can you even say that? But hold on, because that's just the tip of the iceberg with this deep dive.
Okay, so they just come right out and say it. No apologies.
No apologies. And they back it up, too. So the article starts with this bold statement. They're like, the state is not a person.
Interesting. I mean, I could see where they're going with that.
Right, because what they're saying is, look, governments, nations, they don't operate by the same moral code as, like, you and me.
Right, it's a different set of rules.
Totally. They even use this analogy of, like, a chess game,
Okay.
where it's like, yeah, you might have to sacrifice a pawn or even a queen to win the whole thing.
It's strategic, right?
Exactly. And that's their whole point. On a national level, it's all about strategy. National interest, it trumps everything else, even if it seems,
Cold. Calculated.
Yeah. And, you see this throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's
Right.
not like this is a new idea. We're talking about like classic Machiavelli here.
Right. The prince, all that.
Exactly. The concept of realpolitik.
Yeah.
It's basically a fancy way of saying that when it comes to nations, self-interest often wins out over, moral ideals.
It's like what's good for the country, even if it's not, ethically squeaky clean.
Yeah, and the author argues that nations are always weighing these costs and benefits. It's like they're playing on this giant global chessboard.
And they'll make ruthless decisions to get ahead. To prove this, they bring up the fall of the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
Remember Gorbachev?
Right.
And that whole glasnost thing, like
Mhm.
being open, transparent, especially about the past.
Right.
The author actually says Gorbachev admitting all those Stalin atrocities, while, probably the right thing to do, it actually made the Soviet Union collapse faster.
Huh. Because it made them look weak?
Like shining a light on your weaknesses, even with good intentions, it can backfire,
It's like they exposed their underbelly, and everyone saw they were vulnerable.
Exactly. And it's a pattern we see over and over in history. Think about Rome or the British Empire. All these huge empires, they start to decline, and suddenly everyone's talking about their failures.
The narratives shift.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The author isn't condoning the bad stuff, but they're showing how perception, like whether a nation is seen as strong or weak, it plays a huge role in how much power they have.
Yeah, if you look weak, others might try to take advantage of that.
Right. And so then they bring up China.
Fascinating. Because they have a very complicated history.
And that's putting it mildly, especially when you talk about the Cultural Revolution. It was brutal. But instead of apologies, you know what China does. They just keep moving forward. Their whole thing is all about learning from the past.
Which is interesting because how do you learn from something you won't even talk about?
That's the thing, right? And that's where the author drops this term, historical nihilism.
Okay, break that down for me.
So it's like saying that history, it's not even real, that it's just a story, and anyone can change it to fit their agenda.
So it's all up for grabs. The past is whatever you say it is.
And while the author doesn't like that approach, they point out how China uses it really effectively, especially against their rivals.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
It's classic, right? Think about it. Someone tries to call you out for something you did, and you're like, well, what about that time you did this?
It's deflection, but it's also about power.
Exactly. It's a way of saying, you don't get to judge me. And it works because, let's face it, we all have things in our past, right?
Skeletons in the closet, as they say.
Exactly. And bringing them up, it's a way of putting people on the defensive.
Okay, so we've got nations acting in their own self-interest, rewriting history to fit their narrative.
And this is where the article takes a turn, like hold on to your hat kind of turn, because the author, and remember, they're Canadian.
Right.
They're totally against Canada apologizing for the residential school system.
That's a very complicated issue, a very dark period.
And their stance is, well, let's just say they don't hold back.
This should be...
They actually say that maybe a more intense, like way more intense form of cultural assimilation would have been you know.
Oh, boy. Okay, so we're getting into some really controversial territory here.
We are, and I get it. It's like, how can you even say that? But here's the thing, and this is where the author, as extreme as they are, they make you think.
Okay, I'm listening.
They're forcing us to look at how we judge the past. Like, can we really understand what people did back then through today's values?
It's like hindsight's 20/20, right?
Oh.
But can we really apply that to history?
It's almost like they're saying, look, history's all about power dynamics, and admitting you did something wrong, even if it was wrong, it weakens you on the world stage.
So morality takes a backseat to strategy, at least in their view.
Totally. And they take it even further by looking at, like, big institutions, specifically the Catholic Church.
Interesting example, because they've definitely had their share of, shall we say, PR issues.
And they go after the church's apologies for past wrongs.
Okay.
And get this, they compare it to their own faith, which is Orthodox, and they flat out say that it's never been wrong, like ever.
That's a bold statement. I mean, to say that any institution has a perfect track record is, well, quite a claim.
Right. But it gets back to their point, which is, are institutions, just like nations, held to a different standard? Like,
Yeah.
Is morality different when you're that big and powerful?
It's a question a lot of people wrestle with, right?
Yeah.
Like, should institutions be held to the same standards as individuals?
Exactly. And the author's answer seems to be a resounding no.
And their example for this is,
Well, they point to the Catholic Church and the fact that it always seems to be apologizing for something.
right, they've had a lot to apologize for over the centuries.
And their argument is that all these apologies, it actually weakens the church.
Okay, so it's like constantly dwelling on past mistakes, even admitting fault, makes them look bad.
Exactly. It undermines their authority, especially in a world that's always looking for cracks in the foundation, you know?
It's a fascinating, and let's be honest, a very controversial take.
Yeah.
I mean, they're essentially saying that sometimes, maybe even often, power and morality just don't mix.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. So it's like, on the one hand, we want to say, okay, we've learned from our mistakes, but then this author comes along and says, actually, admitting you messed up, that just makes you weaker in the world. Like, other countries will use it against you.
Yeah, it's like that whole historical nihilism thing they were talking about. If anyone can just twist history to fit their own story, then where does that leave us? It's like, how can you even tell what's true anymore?
And they give this example about China, right? Talking about how they criticize the U.S. all the time for how African Americans are treated.
Right, and not that it's not a real issue.
Totally. But the author's saying it's not always about genuine concern. It's about China trying to make America look bad on the world stage.
Classic tactic. You want to distract from your own problems, point the finger at someone else.
And it works because people eat it up. It's like we're programmed to be outraged by hypocrisy.
Totally. So what's the answer then? If you try to bury the past, everyone calls you out for denial. But if you admit to your mistakes, then you're weak and everyone can use it against you.
It's a total catch-22, right? So how do you deal with it? Is there even a way to win this game?
Well, I think the point of reading something like this, even if it's this provocative, isn't necessarily to say, okay, yeah, this author's got it all figured out. It's more like it forces you to think about these things in a different way.
Okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
can see that. So, like, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves?
I mean, for me, it comes down to this. How do we deal with history when it's uncomfortable, when it makes us look bad? Is there even a point to feeling bad about the past? Or is it more important to just, I don't know, focus on the future?
And can countries, like, really atone for what they did? I mean, it's not like you can just apologize and it's all good.
It's way more complicated than that, right? Because the past has a way of sticking around.
Yeah, it's not like you can just erase it. And that's where it gets tricky. Because this author, they almost seem to be saying that we should just prioritize being strong in the present, even if it means, like, being ruthless about history.
Right, like maybe forget about trying to make things right. Just do what you got to do to come out on top.
But then you have other people saying, no, the only way to actually be strong is to own up to the bad stuff, you know,
Yeah.
to actually acknowledge the wrongs that were done.
And I think that's where the real debate lies. Because it's not just about history, it's about the world we want to live in, right? Like, what do we value more? Power or morality?
It's like, do we want a world where it's every nation for themselves, or is there a way to actually move forward together, even with all the baggage?
And that brings us back to the author's whole point about institutional power, with the Catholic Church as an example. You remember how they were super critical of the church, apologizing for everything?
Oh, yeah. Like, it was a bad move. And then they compared it to their own church, the Orthodox one, which they were basically like, oh, yeah, that one's never messed up.
Right, which, I mean, come on. No institution is perfect. They've all got their issues.
For sure. But it goes back to the author's whole thing about how if you're an institution, you can't show weakness, even if it means like not apologizing for something you probably should.
It's like admitting fault undermines your whole authority. And for a big institution, especially a religious one, that authority is everything.
So it's almost like they're saying there are two sets of rules, one for regular people and one for these big, powerful entities, whether it's a country or a church.
Right, and they definitely seem to fall on the side of power trumps everything, which is, kind of a scary thought.
So they're saying, like, the church should just act like it's never wrong, even when it's, obvious they were.
It's more like to maintain that image of authority, they can't ever seem to falter. And this is where, like, the Catholic and Orthodox views clash, right?
Right, because they were saying the Orthodox Church has it all figured out.
And they use that to basically say, look, the Catholic Church, they're always messing up. They're always backtracking.
It's pretty different, right? The Catholics seem to be, like, constantly reevaluating their stance on stuff.
Right, grappling with how their past actions fit in with modern morality.
And then you have the author's view of the Orthodox Church, which is like, nope, we've never been wrong. Ever. Which, like, how is that even possible?
Well, and this is what makes this whole discussion so fascinating. Every institution, every country, even every person, we all have to figure out how to deal with this stuff. What do we do with the parts of the past that don't fit who we want to be now? The author gives us a very specific, and let's be honest, pretty extreme answer. But it makes you think. Right.
For sure. Like, if nothing else, this author gets you thinking.
Right. It's like they're holding up a mirror, but it's one of those, like, distorted funhouse mirrors, You don't quite recognize yourself, but it makes you look twice.
Totally. It's like we came into this deep dive expecting a nice, clear-cut discussion about history, and we're leaving with, like, way more questions than we started with.
And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is admit you don't have all the answers.
True. But it makes me wonder, like, what are we even supposed to do? If we can't agree on how to even think about the past, how do we move forward?
I think it starts by acknowledging that there are different ways to look at things. This author presented a very specific, very provocative perspective. But it's just that, one perspective.
Right? Like, it's not the be-all and end-all.
Exactly. And the more we expose ourselves to these different viewpoints, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, the better equipped we are to actually grapple with the complexity of history.
So it's like, even though this article is kind of out there, it's still important to have these discussions.
Absolutely, because ultimately, history isn't some dusty old textbook, right?
Right.
It's the story of us. It's the foundation for everything we are and everything we're going to become.
That's a good way of putting it. So, like, what's the takeaway here? What do we want our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest thing is to question everything.
Yeah.
Don't just accept what you're told, even if it comes from an authority figure. Dig deeper, look for different perspectives, and most importantly, don't be afraid to have those tough conversations about the past.
It's like that saying, right? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. We can't just bury the uncomfortable parts of history and pretend they never happened. We have to learn from them, even if that means confronting some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Well said. All right, so next time you're thinking about the past, whether it's a monument or a news story, or even just a conversation with your family.
Or listening to a deep dive.
Exactly. Remember, there's always more to the story. And the more we dig deeper, the closer we get to understanding who we are and what kind of world we want to build.